are going to conclude with a little bit of change of pace. We'll change the theme of the talks, and Professor Kaczor will tell us about the just war tradition. And Professor Kaczor is a philosopher, so he's going to teach us scientists how to actually think. In the context of the just war tradition, evolving towards pacifism with a question mark. Professor Christopher Kaczor is chair of the Department of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, and he is the St. Thomas Aquinas Fellow for the Renewal of Catholic Intellectual Life at the Word on Fire Institute. That is an awesome title. He has authored several books, including Jordan Peterson, God and Christianity, The Search for a Meaningful Life, which he co-authored with Matthew Petrusek. And his research on issues of ethics, philosophy, and religion has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, National Review, NPR, BBC, EWTN, ABC, NBC, Fox, CBS, MSNBC, and The Today Show. And he can be found on Twitter at Prof_Kaczor. And he is here to deliver his talk without slides for a refreshing change. So, all yours, Professor Kaczor.
Thank you very much. I do not have slides. Is that going to be a problem? Because I can run back to the hotel right now and whip up slides in, an hour and a half and come back and visit with you. The other problem is that I'm from Los Angeles, and we are at sea level there. And so the altitude up here, if I pass out in the middle of the lecture, it is due to my aptitude at sea level only. So today I want to talk to you about the just war tradition and ask the question, is it evolving towards pacifism? And I want to use as a foil for my remarks, the remarks made last month by Cardinal Robert McElroy. He gave an address at the University of Notre Dame. You can go on YouTube and find the address, and also you can find a printed version of it. And his address, in case you want to check it out, is called Our New Moment, Renewing Catholic Teaching on War and Peace. And this talk represents perhaps the most high-profile advocacy of replacing just war theory with what he calls comprehensive nonviolence. And so what I want to do in my remarks today is interact with his remarks. And I want to set the stage for all this in particular by setting out the conditions for a just war as classically understood. Now, the just war theory has been put forward by a number of thinkers in the Catholic tradition. St. Augustine had an account. Thomas Aquinas had an account. There's other people in the tradition who have accounts of just war theory. But I want to put forward the account that's found in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And this is also advantageous because Cardinal McElroy is interacting with this formulation of just war theory. So it'll be helpful for seeing what he's critiquing. So here are the conditions for a just war according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Quote, the strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. At one and the same time, the damage inflicted by the aggressor, nation, or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be a serious prospect of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. These are the traditional elements enumerated in what's called the just war doctrine. The evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belong to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. So that's, if you want to look it up, Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2309. Now, my remarks will examine three different questions. First, is it true, as Cardinal McElroy claims, that we're in a new moment that justifies a radical revision or rejection of just war theory? Secondly, does the Bishop of San Diego provide sound reasons for rejecting just war theory? And finally, does a misuse of just war theory require rejecting it? And then I'll have some concluding remarks after looking at those three questions. So first, are we now in a new moment? Cardinal McElroy says that now we are in a new moment that requires us to jettison just war theory. And you might say, well, why is that? And he gives three different reasons. First, he says, quote, the continuation of wars among nations and within societies, enlisting devastating weapons and resulting in countless deaths, have pointed to the need to fundamentally renew and prioritize the claim of nonviolent action as the central tenet of Catholic teaching on war and peace, unquote. So this quote, I think, is sort of puzzling because he says it's a new moment, but what he points to is the continuation of wars among societies. In other words, he's not pointing to a change, but rather something that's remained the same since really the dawn of time. There have been societies and peoples that have fought with each other. So in other words, it doesn't seem that we have a new moment, but rather what we have is business as usual. And in fact, at least some scholars argue there has been a change, but in a direction that puts pressure on McElroy's claim. So in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker argues that wars have become much less common, that wars have become actually, over time, less violent for most people. An author in Scientific America put it this way, quote, most scholars agree the percentage of people who die violent war-related deaths has plummeted through history, and that proportionally violent deaths decline as populations become increasingly large and organized, or move from non-state status, such as hunter-gatherer societies, to full-fledged states. So if these scholars are correct, in fact, it's just the opposite of what you might expect from McElroy's claim, that things are getting worse and worse, so we need to tighten up just war theory. In fact, according to these scholars, things in terms of violent death, and particularly deaths in wars, have gotten significantly better over time. But let's assume for the sake of argument that these scholars are wrong, and there are scholars on both sides of this matter. As far as I can tell, the majority of scholars do agree with Pinker, but there are scholars on the other side who also say, no, things are in fact getting worse. So let's assume those other scholars are correct. The question then arises, is the solution to this problem to make just war theory more strict, even so strict as to forbid war entirely? Would this actually alleviate the problem of war being more common? So I'm skeptical about that. And indeed, this approach of making teachings more strict in response to their violation seems in tension with Cardinal McElroy's approach in other areas. So about LGBT individuals, the Bishop of San Diego writes, quote, a church that is calling all men and women to find a home in the Catholic community contains structures and cultures of exclusion that alienate all too many from the church or make their journey in the Catholic faith tremendously burdensome, unquote. So the idea seems to be that because people struggle with the church's teachings on sex, we should ease the burdensomeness of these teachings, make them more lenient, as it were. So my question is, why is inclusion and accompaniment and easing of burdens constantly invoked for those who struggle with the church's teachings on sex and marriage, but not invoked for those who struggle with the church's teaching on just war or capital punishment? It seems, in other words, that inclusion or accompaniment is sought only for one side of the divide, but not for the other. And this approach is not consistent. In terms of pastoral practice, the soul of each person matters, regardless of one's sexual orientation or one's view on just war theory. Now, in terms of doctrine, what's at issue is actually what is ethically correct, what is morally right. And the percentages of people who violate a particular moral norm are irrelevant to the question of whether the norm in question actually is correct. So in fact, right now, there's no people, 0 people on planet Earth, who love God with their whole heart, their whole soul, and their whole mind, and love their neighbor as themselves every day perfectly. So this norm is violated by literally 100% of people. And yet, this norm remains true despite a 100% violation record. So sociological data can certainly inform pastoral practice, but it's hard to see how a greater or lesser number of people following a norm leads necessarily to the need for a more strict or a less strict norm, whether the norm is about sexual activity or about just war. So The second reason that Cardinal McElroy says that we're in a new moment, he expresses in the following way. Quote, "The atrophying of the just war framework as an effective constraint on war or pathway to peace calls the Church to redesign its moral framework for permitting war in dire circumstances," unquote. So the claim seems to be that we need to revise just war because it's no longer an effective constraint on war. And this claim seems to presuppose that just war theory was once an effective constraint, but now is no longer an effective constraint. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that this supposition is true. The next question I have is, why was just war once an effective constraint on war? It seems plausible to think that among world leaders, a vibrant Christian faith informing their decisions about war is less common in recent times than, say, in the Middle Ages. So, if it's true that just war theory does not hold rulers back from war, I think this is most plausibly explained by either weak or non-existent faith commitments in contemporary rulers. So, the weakening of just war theory in constraining war has nothing at all to do with the theory of just war, but has everything to do with the rulers who don't take just war theory seriously. The third shift that McElroy notes is this, quote, "The failure of nuclear deterrence as a step on the way to nuclear disarmament has produced a situation where we are facing the breakdown of the arms control regime and the possibility of the use of tactical nuclear weapons," unquote. Now, unfortunately, he is right that nuclear deterrence has failed as a step on the way to nuclear disarmament. More nations today have nuclear weapons than did in the 1950s. But why should we think that the goal of nuclear deterrence is to move towards nuclear disarmament? It seems much more plausible to think of nuclear deterrence as a deterrence against nuclear war. And on this score, nuclear deterrence appears to be tremendously successful. The last time such a weapon was used, as everyone knows, was August 9th, 1945. So it would seem that nuclear deterrence has been, in fact, tremendously successful as a deterrent. That it has failed as a step towards many valuable other things, that's true. But none of those failures make deterrence itself a failure. So all three of the shifts that Cardinal McElroy points to fail to indicate, in my view at least, a new moment that causes us to revise just war theory. So in the second part of my paper, what I want to talk about is his fundamental critiques of just war theory. And most of this, a lot of this draws on his quotations from various popes. So the Bishop of San Diego says, quote, "Pope John proclaimed, 'It's hardly possible to imagine in an atomic era war could be used as an instrument of justice.' And Pope Paul VI journeyed to the United Nations to plead with the world, 'No more war, war never again.' Pope John Paul II taught that war is never an appropriate way to settle disputes among peoples. And Joseph Ratzinger chose the name Benedict to frame his entire pontificate as an ode to Pope Benedict XV, who tried to end all war," unquote. Now, none of these statements from any of the popes call into question, let alone reject, just war theory. We can all hope and wish with St. Paul VI that we can have war never again. But given human realities from the dawn of time, it's highly unlikely this wish will be granted or this hope realized. War is, in fact, never an appropriate way to settle mere disputes among peoples, which is why just war theory does not list settling disputes as a just cause for war. So the cardinal in particular, though, emphasizes the teaching of Pope Francis, because he sees Pope Francis as a key to his view that we should revise just war theory to embrace comprehensive nonviolence. He says, quote, "It is Pope Francis who has utilized the trajectory of all these statements to construct a framework for Catholic teaching on war and peace that places nonviolence, rather than just war ethic, as the dominant prism through which to evaluate decisions in situations of deep conflict. In Fratelli Tutti," he writes, the Pope, that is, he writes, "we can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it's very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war," unquote. Now, in my view, Pope Francis just isn't saying what Cardinal McElroy wishes he would say. When Pope Francis says we can no longer think of war as a solution, this is not a condemnation of just war in favor of comprehensive nonviolence. First, the grounds given by the Pope for this statement is the risks of war will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. He did not say its risk will necessarily always be greater than its supposed benefits. War does have great risks, which is exactly why traditional just war theory attempted to limit war. What Pope Francis says is that it's very difficult to justify war, not that it's impossible. But this statement is perfectly compatible with just war theory. Indeed, elsewhere, Pope Francis has recently said, quote, "A war may be just. There is a right to defend oneself," unquote. Now, I do think it's fair to say that just war is more difficult to justify today than it was in ages past, in part because the power of conventional weapons makes even foreseen side effects of military intervention more burdensome for non-combatants than it was in the Middle Ages. The formulation of the Catechism already makes this clear. But we should not be naive and think of war in the Middle Ages as just knights out in a field, with swords fighting each other, and the women and the children are safe in the castle just doing whatever. In fact, in the Middle Ages, one method of war was to launch burning arrows into castles. Now, if you do that, you couldn't possibly know where the arrow is going to hit, who it's going to hit. And if the arrow is burning and things catch on fire, well, that's going to kill women and children as well. Moreover, in the Middle Ages, one classic tactic of war was the siege, right? You get around the castle, you wouldn't allow any food to get in or out, and you'd starve the people to death, right? And obviously that doesn't just starve the male knights who are fighting or something. So in fact, war in the Middle Ages, when these criteria were formulated, already had the risk of non-combatants being caught up into it. The Bishop of San Diego quotes Pope Francis again, quote, "Every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not be mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more to those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and the displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood," unquote. Now, this is a very moving passage, and I think we should all be concerned with victims and people that are suffering terribly. The trouble, though, is a just war is sometimes precisely undertaken in order to prevent still further victims. In other words, if we got rid of just war entirely, you can imagine that human suffering would not decrease, but rather increase. So imagine, for example, if during World War II, the Allies simply refused to fight and just allowed Hitler to take over as much as he wanted, and the Russians refused to fight. Well, what would be the end result of that? Well, one end result would be that concentration camps would have run till every Jew and many other people would have been killed. I mean, you'd have had a Holocaust, as bad as the Holocaust was, it would have been much, much worse if there was no intervention at all. And you'd have much of the world dominated by totalitarian dictators, and they would cause unbelievable suffering for people. So the suffering of people does matter, but it's not obvious that the suffering of people leads to the conclusion, therefore we have to get rid of just war. Another way to think about it would be something like this. Sometimes the only way to stop a school shooter is for the police to shoot the shooter. Sometimes violence is the only way to stop some killers from continuing their killing spree. Just war theory already has within its framework that if there are alternatives, then those alternatives should be used. But in the real world, sometimes the only remaining alternative is to use violence to stop violence. Third point of my paper. Does misuse of just war theory require rejecting it? So Cardinal McElroy argues that in the modern day, he argues that the just war framework has, quote, operated as a source of justification for those inclined to go to war rather than as a constraint on war. So the idea is that just war theory fails because it can be used as a rationalization by those already committed to going to war. But of course, any moral theory can be misused, and any moral rule bent to serve one's desires. The misuse of something does not remove its use. In fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church does what can be done to mitigate against a lax or easygoing application of just war criteria in order to rationalize military intervention. So recall, the Catechism says the strict conditions for legitimate self-defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such decisions makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. Now, a ruler wishing to rationalize a rush to war may wish the Catechism taught something like this: the malleable conditions for legitimate self-defense by the military require a flexible consideration. The levity of such a decision makes it subject to easily met conditions of moral legitimacy. I mean, as you can see from the, substituting and the antonyms, the Catechism is pushing back as much as it can on a kind of lax interpretation. The Catechism, in fact, just war theory is, as such, always a constraint on war. The default, in other words, is that the war is unjust. War is only justified if those various conditions are met. All the conditions, not just some, all of them. Cardinal McElroy writes, one accelerant for this trend of rationalization for justifying war was the unfortunate statement in the Catechism that the evaluation of just war criteria belongs to those who have responsibility for the common good. It is objective moral reality which determines whether the jus ad bellum has been met, not the views of political leaders, unquote. Now, I respectfully disagree with the Cardinal that the Catechism's formulation was unfortunate. St. Thomas Aquinas taught that in a just war, it is the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged, unquote. Now, this condition is important because it limits what counts as a just war tremendously. If the sovereign and only the sovereign may licitly do some action, then no one else may licitly do that action. By contrast, the action of buying and selling goods can be legally done by private individuals. So there are innumerable agents that can initiate market transactions. But it makes sense to limit it to the sovereign, to limit it to political leaders. Why? Because they have special responsibility for the common good. And so it's political leaders who have a special responsibility for defending the common good. These leaders also typically have the most up-to-date and comprehensive information, both about prospects of success of a military response and also about whether all other means to putting an end to the conflict have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Now, of course, anyone can make a judgment about whether a particular war is just. We all have some share in responsibility for the common good. But it makes sense to highlight the special role played by those who have political authority. Now, needless to say, the judgment of such leaders about what is or is not a just war is fallible, right? People can make mistakes and do make mistakes. So, in summing up his argument so far, the Cardinal writes, quote, if one was asked in 1983 to state what framework stood as the central point of reference for the Church on armed conflict, they would have correctly answered the just war theory. If we are asked today to answer that question, we must answer comprehensive nonviolence. So it would seem the Cardinal is abandoning just war theory in favor of comprehensive nonviolence. But he isn't. I don't know how, anyway. In the very next sentence, however, Cardinal McElroy walks back his commitment to comprehensive nonviolence. He writes, quote, even in recognizing the gospel exhortation to reject warfare in all its forms, and even in recognizing the manifest frequent superiority of outcomes through nonviolent resistance, there are instances which call out for military action against profoundly barbaric aggression. We're witnessing just such a moment in Ukraine. The moral claim for the defense of Ukraine is clear and compelling. Thus, the fundamental moral justification for military action is unassailable, unquote.
Logical disconnect.
Now, is this not an application of just war theory? How is this justification of military action compatible with comprehensive nonviolence? McElroy appears to advocate for both pacifism in principle and just war in Ukraine. How does he square this circle? In this address, he does not. So, in conclusion, let me point out that although Cardinal McElroy's critique of just war theory is, in my view, not persuasive, I think actually he does make a contribution potentially to the development of just war theory. He says, quote, "The just war tradition does not include a realistic set of moral criteria for seeking war termination." And I think that's right. In other words, you could imagine developing the just war theory in some way to have some sort of account of when wars should be completed. And I think that there can be needless death and needless suffering if every conflict is seen as the other side has to surrender unconditionally, otherwise we're just going to fight to the bitter end and continue the fighting. Like at the end of World War II, there are many people killed in the last month or so. You wonder, did any of that have to happen? So I think he's right on that. He also suggests another, quote, "Another major deficiency in just war framework is its lack of attention to the moral obligations of other nations in minimizing a military conflict." And I think that's true too, that you could imagine somehow developing some sort of theory where you see a war on the horizon, a war brewing, maybe other nations in some way could, I'm not exactly sure how this would work. It doesn't seem like the United Nations and other international bodies have been very successful in stopping this, but maybe we can think of new ways that other nations could collaborate and really put pressure on nations not to even begin war. But all those things would be supplements to just war theory. That's very different than just scrapping just war theory. So in conclusion, Cardinal McElroy gives no good reason to think that we are now in a new moment which grounds giving up just war theory in favor of comprehensive nonviolence. Secondly, he does not provide sound reasons for rejecting just war theory. Indeed, he himself holds that military response in Ukraine is just. And finally, while he's right that just war theory could be augmented and added to and developed, he seems wrong, I think, in holding that the abuse of just war theory takes away its legitimate use. So someone looking for good reason to jettison just war theory will not find it in Cardinal McElroy's address. So, thank you.